This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelic renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. Brian Pace is an academic and deep thinker with a quarter-century of experience in psychedelics. He joins me for this episode and brings his Portland-bred spirit of challenge and change to our conversation about psychedelics access, authoritarianism, and pragmatism. Though Brian would prefer to dispense with kingdoms altogether, his keys are community, discussion, and decriminalization. He's a self-described anti-capitalist and a recovering psychedelics cheerleader who now keeps a critical eye on the psychedelic space as part of Symposia, a nonprofit media org focused on complex connections between drugs, economics, politics, and culture. Brian and his Symposia colleagues call out questionable practices, oppressive systems, ethical lapses, and dangerous associations in psychedelics because, well, someone has to. Being the sharp end of the stick may not win fans, but it does make Brian undeniably compelling, and this conversation is likely to leave you with something new to consider. Brian, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's as I was just saying a little bit earlier, I do feel like I've done a bit of a cheat. I haven't shown up to your classes, but I've gotten all the good learning from you. So I really, really appreciate an opportunity to actually process all the thinking I've been doing, inspired by your articles, videos I've seen, video talks I've seen with you. Now I get this opportunity to actually have my own office hour. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome to it. And I definitely talk about different things at Symposia and on our live streams and podcasts than I talk about in my psychedelic studies class. But yeah, thanks for paying attention to what we do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have a number of conversational prompts for us, but obviously, we can also move in some organic directions as well. I think the first question I'll ask, though, is for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with you, just wondering if you could situate yourself, share your personal, professional relationship with psychedelics, help folks understand what you do, why you do it, and what motivates you.
Okay, so I'd like to say that I've been doing psychedelics one way or another for about 25 years. And I'm out in that respect. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Nishay Devaneux, has written a series for Symposia called "Coming Out of the Psychedelic Closet," which talks about how some people do have the privilege to speak openly about using illegal substances, and there's a if you can, if you're situated in such a way where that's possible, there are social benefits for others if people are more open about their experiences. And so I'm an academic. I got my PhD in plant evolutionary ecology a couple of years back. That means I've spent a lot of time thinking about time and space and sex and death, but specifically plants, the relationship between people and plants. We call that ethnobotany. I did my field work in southern Mexico, working with maize in Mayan communities. I did master's work in the prairie, working on sunflower. I've spent a lot of time thinking about scientific controversy with my scholastic efforts, but I've also looked at things, used methods of inquiry, looking at phytochemistry, did some undergraduate work with mycology, and some sort of extracurricular work in the Ecuadorian Amazon, using Paul Stamets's techniques of mycoremediation to clean up oil left by Chevron Texaco. So I've traveled around the world quite a bit. I do have an international perspective. I think a lot about how the policies that the United States enacts, that the sort of the global North enacts, affects the third world, poor countries, the end of the pipe of industrial capitalism, and the source for extractive resource, accumulation. So yeah, like a lot of my travel has taken me to places where people don't have access to a lot of the benefits of the global economy.
Yeah. And what motivates you around this? How did you come to this? I mean, I don't imagine that anyone is 6 years old and says, when I grow up, I want to be an ethnobotanist, right? It's not
Yeah.
something that we come to easily. So how did you come to it?
I mean, I like to say that like my early experiences with psychedelics were, liberatory in that they enabled me to find, other ways to be, and that was a constant conversation. So I disagree with the sort of Alan Wattses of the world that say once you get the message, hang up the phone. I like keeping in touch, and
yeah, I agree with you on that. I actually imagine that psychedelics will be an ongoing aspect of my being a human for the rest of my being a human. I don't imagine that there's a point at which I'm done.
Right. So, I mean, I would say that like the greatest thing that I've taken from this is curiosity, because psychedelics are in life is nothing if not a mystery. And so, the experiences that I had early on really did lead me to an interest in life sciences. But I was originally interested in I grew up in Portland, Oregon, really originally interested in studying like political science, which I did for a couple of years, but rapidly realized that much of the world's conflict would be surrounding resource allocation. And so a lot of my PhD work focused on like food security in the global South, Mexico, as a lens through in the context of climate change. So all of that, I think, is what I focused my thoughts on. But I was sort of doing a parallel independent study of psychedelics throughout that time. So I mentioned I was in the Amazon. Well, ayahuasca is in the Amazon. Mexico is an incredibly rich environment for traditional uses of a number of psychedelics, namely mushrooms, peyote, morning glory, and that kind of stuff. So
gotcha. One thing that I noticed too, which has been quite impactful for me in encountering you, is there is the impetus of critique and skepticism in your work. You really do write a lot about what we should be paying attention to, what we should be critiquing, what we should be skeptical of. What motivates you to that as well?
Well, so that's a group effort at Symposia. We are a 501c3 watchdog in the public interest for the drug reform, the drug culture space, which is rapidly changing. Some might say being colonized, as there's quite a bit of interest from capital. And we are explicitly anti-capitalist. My view, my global view of the existential crisis that we face with climate change is that it's important to name the system that has caused this existential crisis, and that system is capitalism. So, seeing how a new market is approached by capital is a lens that we explore at Symposia. We aren't sitting on the boards of startups. We are not. We're just not beholden to the same kinds of funding strategies. We're crowdfunded. We've got a patreon at .com/symposia if you want to support us. And we don't have any paid staff. So the reality is that aside from the fact that like I teach university a university course on psychedelics, like there's a separation between how if psychedelics disappeared, I would find other work. And so I'm not looking to make my first 10 million on the psychedelic mush rush, shroom boom, whatever you want to call it. And I feel like there are a lot of people who are, and in fact, there's a lot of people who are trying to make their next 10 million on this world. So
we are most definitely going to be talking about that as well. So
someone needs to be looking out for the public, and we did not see that niche being filled. So
got it. How did Symposia come together? And I asked this not with the intention to be provocative, but just to play devil's advocate. Who decides that Symposia is the watchdog? So how do you all come together, and where do you get the authority to be the watchdog?
So we've thought a lot about authority and its manufacture. And in some ways, what happens at Symposia is so first of all, Symposia wasn't always a watchdog. I'm a relatively newcomer to Symposia. Symposia was originally an LLC and it's been around, I think, since 2013, 2014, something like that.
No, Brian, that sounds capitalist to me.
And it was, on the other hand, there's certain, sort of a certain expediency towards just getting something together and seeing if it flies. I should say I've run several businesses in my life. I was a pedicab owner operator for many years. I did run a construction company, although we were a worker-owned collective in Portland, Oregon, called Circle A Contracts and Services. So do with that what you will. Anyhow, I didn't have much to do with Symposia's earlier iterations. However, I did admire their output. The things that they were doing, I was like, these are conversations that are necessary in the space. I point again to Nishay Devano's work on Dr. Nishay Devano's work on coming out of the psychedelic closet, psychedelics, identity politics, and queer theory. But it was only in the last couple of years that we decided, where we were going, and it was in a response to how the space was changing, that we realized that there was this need, and that a nonprofit structure was the most appropriate way of signaling our intent in the space.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So that's it. It's helpful actually then to it's a helpful segue to kind of get into some of what has really inspired my thought process and helped me think very differently about psychedelics. I come to psychedelics after 2 years of very private work. I haven't been publicly active in psychedelics until this year. And, so I sort of come with just my experience and so just my own intentions, which, I believe are focused on healing and development and evolution. And I come into this space and somehow I find Symposia's work and I find your work, and I'm reading about psychedelics and capitalism and the active promotion of extreme beliefs, conspiracy in psychedelics, marshaling psychedelics to further the status quo, radicalization and power in psychedelics. These were not things I was thinking about until I discovered Symposia. And then it was like, oh my God, I have to think about these things. Like if you're serious about, and I am serious about advocating for broader access to psychedelics, it's really important to think about these things. So it's interesting, kind of getting to a question I want to talk to you about, and is one of the kind of the primary things that we discussed when we were preparing. I've seen other people write that, when you engage in psychedelics, it strengthens you against propaganda, right? It's sort of, because how it opens your mind, you're not necessarily as susceptible to propaganda. But your work has highlighted how psychedelics actually makes people very vulnerable to radicalization, which is why we see psychedelics in QAnon. And then there are also these big funders of psychedelics, these who've been, characterized as extreme capitalists, oligarchs, authoritarians like Peter Thiel and Rebecca Mercer.
Mhm.
I'm really just curious to sort of hear you talk about, because I've read what you've had to say, but I'm curious to hear you talk about why capitalism in psychedelics is so problematic.
Well, so okay. I mean, generally speaking, I would refer to my earlier statement in that capitalism is the system that is, risking our grandchildren's habitability on this planet. So, I
Okay.
mean, I take that as a sort of a face value kind of thing, having spent well over a decade of serious scholastic study of the issues that face us, in terms of looking at and looking at it through the lens of um, the poorest and most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Um, Climate change is going to hit sub-Saharan Africa and tropical, equatorial countries first and hardest. In fact, I need to correct myself, is impacting those communities. So,
Yeah.
um, so that's the place that I start. But the
And if
people
and
who are,
if I and I'm
yeah,
sorry, if I could interrupt, just maybe summarize that or understand that for myself.
mhm, sure.
Do I hear you saying that ultimately capitalism is a toxic context? There's no getting around the reality that capitalism is a toxic
Yeah,
context.
there's no ethical production or consumption under capitalism is a common adage in the anti-capitalist world.
Okay.
And when you really think about like where your stuff comes from, where does it come from? Like some of this is like, okay, so some of this is basic sort of leftism. The
Mhm.
labor theory of value states that workers are the ones who create value, and that capitalists are the ones who extract value.
Extract that value from workers. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
None of this. Let me look at the discourse around coronavirus. Who's an essential worker? How much do they get paid?
Mhm.
We just saw the Democrats vote down a $15 an hour wage for those very same quote unquote essential workers.
Yeah. The heroes.
So the heroes,
Yeah,
right?
we can't give the heroes more than $15 an hour. We can't do that.
Yeah, so exploitation just doesn't just mean fucking people over. It's a technical term that means to take the surplus value that is created by people that, because of certain social relations, don't have title to that
Yeah.
which they create.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the 101. But like, um, look, billionaires shouldn't exist, and they they're a recent invention, like a blink of an eye. The recent history of the political economy dating back to the 80s or so is what has created the conditions for these people to proliferate. I don't think they're good for society. I
But there
don't
were
think that.
but there were early 20th century, you know, billionaire
That's
equivalents,
true.
right?
If we look at things in real dollars, like for instance, John D. Rockefeller would
Exactly.
probably have what, like $420 billion in today's
Mhm.
dollars. But I mean, I don't think appealing to robber barons like is, well, okay, yes, they exist. They existed
Yeah,
before. So
that
yeah,
was my only question.
yeah,
But then I would also say too, like there and I want to be really clear, not for you, but for people listening, that
yeah,
the purpose of this conversation is not for me to change your mind about capitalism
no, and
or
I
for you to change my mind about like that's not why we're having this
sure,
conversation, right? So I'm not here to argue with you about capitalism, right? So I
right.
just want to make sure that if listeners are saying, how can you let him say all those bad things about capitalism? It's like, I want to actually sort of hear what the perspective is. So I just
Yeah.
want to be
So
really
in some
clear about
ways,
that.
I want to just sort of apologize and say that, you know, I don't want to take like an argumentative tone, but in some ways, like I feel like we need to sort of lay the foundation for a perspective that I think is alien to a lot of folks.
Most definitely. And Brian, if you didn't take an argumentative tone, I wouldn't even know who you were, man. Like, come on, like that's what you do. So it's all right. It's all right. I
Well,
just want to be clear. Like, we're not here to like debate this. Like, I really want to actually get a clear understanding. So when I'm asking questions, even if they are devil's advocate or provocative questions, I'm really just, I want to flesh this out with you.
yeah, so you sort of put some names to these billionaire games, and you mentioned Peter Thiel, you mentioned Rebecca Mercer. So Rebecca Mercer is from the Mercer family. Her father, I think it's Robert Mercer.
Yeah, it's Robert. Yeah.
He made money in artificial intelligence, and then that became an empire. And that empire, he was a computer scientist, has birthed outfits like Cambridge Analytica. We would not have Trump as the 45th president of the United States without the big data effort of of the Mercer family. Rebecca Mercer is a co-founder of Breitbart, which is a white nationalist media outlet. And these aren't like, we're not talking about opinions here. Like, there were leaked emails that outline clear strategies of making alliances with open, well, like racist, fascist, white supremacists. Like that's there. So the effects of the Mercers is that a recent Salon article that I linked to in Turn Off Your Mind and Float Right Wing towards the end there quotes a Republican insider who identifies Rebecca Mercer and the Mercer family as the chief funders of the fascist movement globally and the white supremacist white nationalist movement in the United States. I'll take that on good authority. Yeah. And they gave $1 million to MAPS.
Yes, and just to be clear for folks who may be hearing MAPS for the first time, that is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Yeah.
One of the leading nonprofit organizations moving psychedelics along through the FDA approval process so that they can be more widely accessible. So the Mercer family, Rebecca Mercer, has been a funder of MAPS, and MAPS has taken the Mercer money. Right. I see that you see that that is incredibly problematic, right? So,
well, let's just say it's not a gift. Like philanthropy, philanthropy serves a purpose in this whole system. As I mentioned in the Float Right Wing article, some of
which we will link to in the show notes for folks. Great. So you'll be able to resource that.
So some of this is reputational laundering, and I'm kind of glad that we brought up robber barons, because they're the ones who invented philanthropy. When Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Hall, John D. Rockefeller started an institution that I spent years of my life trying to work for and ended up doing a year partnership with, which was CIMMYT, the Center for International Maize and Wheat Improvement, that was founded in part to prevent the third world starvation from turning into domino theory and into turning into revolution. So the philanthropy of these very rich individuals, it serves a couple of purposes. One is to put their name on some building, a museum or what have you. We have very real financial tax benefits. Anything that is given away in charitable giving is deductible.
Yeah. So there's legacy building. There's tax benefit, and I think you actually in your work you speak to something a little bit more, let's just say problematic, with philanthropy, particularly in psychedelics. Can you illuminate on that a little bit?
I mean,
Like, this is not just about legacy building and tax benefits when we're talking about the kind of money that's coming into the psychedelic space
well, there's
philanthropically.
like, so there's a lot going on there. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. So
Well, when you talk about sort of like the illiberal tendencies behind this money.
yeah, well, I mean, what kind of edifice is being built? So Dr. Ido Hardickson, I really hope I struggle with pronunciation sometimes, but he was on our podcast on Plus Three. We did an interview with him. If you want to check out his work, he has a great book called American Trip. He does a good job of describing what the sort of basics of the subjective experiences of psychedelics generally are. One is meaning magnification. Two is hyperassociation. So the mashing together of different concepts, feelings, synesthesia. And three is boundary dissolution. None of those have anything to do with like world peace and, you know, universal siblinghood. These are just cognitive effects, but, you know, meaning magnification, these are powerful tools. Their introduction into the West was before the hippies, it was the CIA, and they were attempting to use them to bend people's will to their efforts. And in Lucy and the Sky with Nazis, this one of the central theses that I started the piece out with is that if we accept that, you know, set and setting and dosage are a central dogma of the psychedelic experience, writ large, the psychedelic renaissance, its setting is capitalism. And so, yeah, that's going to have an effect on that trip that we're on.
Yes, indeed. And I think, you know, what your work is pushing people to pay attention to is what those effects might be, and how do we you know, how do we conduct ourselves, and what decisions do we make in that regard. And that brings me to kind of my next conversational point. You know, I'm a Black gay woman who invested in Compass Pathways, pre-patent nonsense and pre-ETFs. And this is a company that Peter Thiel is associated with. I have had my, you know, just, I don't know Peter Thiel personally, and I've never had a conversation with him, and I don't know, you know, who he is and what he intends. I only know what I absorb about him out in culture, and what I've absorbed about him out in culture, I find troublesome. For various reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into those. But the reason I chose Compass Pathways is because I also know that wherever that white man goes, money follows. And so, you know, one of the questions I've had to ask myself is, am I participating in my own oppression? And I wonder what your thoughts might be about that. I've been just keen to have that conversation with you. What do you think about that? Because because I'm so sorry, because the other part of it is, let's say I don't ride in, you know, Mercer and Thiel's, you know, psychedelic funding wake, and the spoils just continue to go to the moneyed and the powerful. Am I then participating in my own marginalization? Right. So, you know, how do people outside of these power structures, whether by class, race, gender, myriad social barriers, how do we reconcile this damned if we do, damned if we don't conundrum?
So in some ways, like, you know, I'm not the person to tell you whether or not you're participating in your own oppression. Okay. That's not my place. If we're talking about who Peter Thiel is, though, you know, Peter Thiel is somebody who's invested about $12 million into a tie. Came out very open and vocally for Trump, who
a tie is actually, could you just clarify?
A tie Life Sciences is some of the biggest capital investment in the it's a company, and run by Christian Angermeyer, and they have their fingers in a lot of psychedelic pots. So they're doing a lot of drug development and are attempting to use psychedelics to cure the mental health crisis, to quote or paraphrase some of their work. So Peter Thiel has made a major investment and has been a part of like $125 million round. His own stake is something like is 12 million. But yeah, who's Thiel? I mean, Thiel is somebody who's been very open. Like, so Noam Chomsky said that if you want to know what's going on, just read the business pages. It's not like the elite are lying about their intentions. So what has Peter Thiel written in the business pages? Well, if you look up an op-ed he did in the Wall Street Journal, I believe he wrote an opinion piece called "Competition is for Losers." So what are his intentions in the psychedelic space? What are Compass's intentions in the psychedelic space? Well, it certainly isn't competition and access. That's a loser. That's not something that's going to give a high return on investment for investors and venture capital. I guarantee you that $120 million that was invested in that round that Peter Thiel was essential in organizing, they're going to get a lot more out. At least that's their intent. Nobody makes those bets without making sure that you get more than you put in, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I'm problematizing good old American entrepreneurial spirit here. But look, like Compass is building a strategy of regulatory capture. And that regulatory capture is going to make sure that their good manufacturing practice, process patented crystalline polymorph psilocybin is the only psilocybin that is FDA approved. That if you're using things outside of their approval process, you're irresponsible. You're not following professional standards. These are the people who are trying to patent comfy couches in the use of therapy. Okay, so their intentions are very clear.
Yeah, it's monopolization. We want to own this market.
But okay, so Peter Thiel, though, there's an article that you can look up if you just look up like Peter Thiel and apartheid. Peter Thiel is alleged to have said something like, apartheid's like a viable economic system. Very lizard-like view of social relations. So in a roundabout way of like addressing your question, because I don't want to like dodge it. I also am not going to tell you what to think about how you move through the world.
Like I'm stating the question that way, particularly to really highlight the challenge of these are the folks who own the space. These
are the folks who are trying to own the space, whether or not we choose to participate and help them manufacture the cage that we would live in, that they would have us live in. That's up to us. I bring up apartheid because one of the major ways that apartheid was, aside from the fact that Peter Thiel said some rather regrettable things about it that I'm sure he doesn't regret, one of the ways that apartheid was addressed by the international community, as far as I'm aware, was divestment. People refused to support with their money that system.
Money talked, and the system had to walk.
So you're right. You're right. As individuals, we can make a lot of money if we make smart investments in some of these companies that are sure to increase value at some point, right? But the climate change discourse, which I'm intimately aware of and it serves as a touchstone in my life, individual action is worthless.
Exactly. That's the point I'm getting at. Like, as an individual, when I think about this, part of what I think about is, well, if these are the elements in the psychedelic space, and I know, sort of their money making prowess, there's a degree to which I do not want to be left behind or marginalized. But then there is also this sort of, who do I throw my lot in with, right? So it's
I have a quick question. I mean,
yeah, go for it.
is your investment portfolio part of your spiritual and psychedelic journey, or is it something different?
That's a great question, actually. Is my investment portfolio part of my spiritual and psychedelic journey? I would say that my financial health is part of my spiritual and psychedelic journey. And so I do my best to pay attention to what it is how it is that I contribute to that health. But this is why I'm actually having this conversation with you, because this one has been particularly problematic, right? This notion, like, I know who's invested in Compass Pathways, and there is this association that makes me uncomfortable. Like, it's, part of the reason why I could not invest in Palantir, for example, even though I know, Palantir is going to go on to be a very, financially successful company, but I just couldn't go there. I could not invest in Palantir.
Palantir, for those of you who are listening, is one of Peter Thiel's other ventures that is intimately involved in what will happen in psychedelia. They are a surveillance capitalist big data firm, and their CEO recently stated that some of their products have been used to kill people. We know that at least 600 undocumented persons were rounded up in a single raid in Mississippi, I believe, with the use of Palantir's databases. People who are undocumented are difficult to locate by government services, sort of by definition. And so Palantir aggregates things like electric bills and Facebook profiles, and it triangulates these people who are otherwise not in the government roles. And they gave all this information to ICE and sent people off, to be deported. Some drone strikes.
Yeah, I could not have my money be, even my little tiny, likely insignificant investment in Palantir. I just couldn't have it be a part of that. So the short answer to your question is yes, my financial health is part of my spiritual and psychedelic journey. And I am also paying attention to, and at what point and for what reasons do I compromise that journey? My wife asked me a question the other day. We were just, we're talking about work life and this and the interest and passion I have now in psychedelics. And she asked me, what amount of money would a job have to offer you for you to walk away from working in psychedelics? And I felt this pain in the center of my chest, just even considering that there is a notion of there's an amount of money where I would walk away from psychedelics. And then, there's this reality that I have of living in the system that I do and having the needs that I have. So there's this moment of tension and friction for me around compromise. And I think that's why it's been really helpful for me to encounter and engage the work that you're doing, because I have to sit with myself and think about this. And so that's why, I bring that question to you about.
Yeah. So your project has a really interesting title: The Keys to the Castle.
To the Kingdom.
And to the Kingdom. Thank you.
I don't want the castle, dude. I want the whole kingdom.
The whole thing. Okay. So it's interesting because, the image that is evoked, it's somewhat adjacent to a metaphor that I have used to discuss these corporate-delic actors. And that is one of enclosure. So enclosure of the commons was something that, happened, is usually associated with the Middle Ages. It's where we get the idea of, we get the words about hedging. They literally planted hedges to enclose the commons that were held in common. They were common lands. You could hunt, you could collect firewood. And they were managed collectively. So we're not talking about the tragedy of the commons here. It turns out in real life, when people have collective interest in managing natural resources, they do it pretty well, actually. But armored knights showed up, invincible Terminator types, and they started planting hedges and killing anybody who started hunting and gathering firewood. And they said, "This land is not your land. This is my land." And that feudal period was how kingdoms were made in that period. It was a period of privatization, enclosure. Yeah. And so when we think about psychedelics, they are off patent. And when we look at something like the strategies of compass pathways, George Goldsmith's earlier work was in a company called Tapestry Networks.
And who's George? Just for
George Goldsmith is the CEO of Compass Pathways, and Tapestry Networks trafficked in regulatory capture. So regulatory capture is one way of thinking about it is the revolving door between government and industry. But specifically, this is when industry captures the regulatory bodies and says that the things that we do, they are allowed. We're the only people allowed to do them, and so it's a way of creating exclusivity. So this was the expertise of Tapestry Networks that George Goldsmith is now bringing to bear to the psychedelic world, working with the FDA. The idea being that their product, which will be psychedelic therapy, wrapped around a long off-patent molecule, a molecule that we could say is in the commons. They'll wrap plastic around the ineffable and sell it to us all. Something that grows from shit without help from anybody. And now so you have to build a fence if you want to stand at the gate and charge tickets.
Yep. Very good point. Yep. What I would want though, and maybe this is a Pollyanna fallacy for me, but I think about this in every company that I'm invested in. Is it's not often the case that companies have investors like me. And I want there to be more and more and more of me. I wonder if one of the ways to turn the tide is to divest. I also wonder though, if one of the ways to turn the tide is to open the inclusion of investment so broadly that there's no way that the original intent was to include folks like me. So I wonder if that's also a path to driving that kind of change in mindfulness.
So I, in many ways, I look at the structure of things. Okay, so more individual investors who are going to influence a company to not be profitable every quarter.
No. Okay. No, you don't influence the company to not be profitable. But there is the potential to influence the company to be responsible. Now it takes mass for sure. It takes mass. I don't doubt that at all. So me alone, I'm not going to influence the company to be responsible. But the fact that there are so many people of color and people of sort of people who are in minority positions when it comes to power, standing outside, I want those gates to be open.
Okay, so we sort of started this conversation talking about access to psychedelics. Okay, so I sort of painted a picture that there is a multi-million-dollar effort by people who don't believe in competition, who want to capture value and position themselves as the only players in the game, right? And you're invested this project for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm.
And getting more people to invest in that project, I would problematize that quite a bit. I would vigorously suggest that is not a good strategy for creating access. And in fact, the strategy for creating access that has already succeeded is decriminalization.
Mm.
Decriminalization is a political and not market solution. Currently on the black market, mushrooms don't cost that much.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see an access solution turning psilocybin therapy, for example, into a $6,000 insurance nightmare when they currently cost $15 for a go at a jam band like a jam band, parking lot. And maybe that's inaccessible. Maybe not everybody wants to go to a fish show. I certainly don't. I don't enjoy that kind of stuff. Okay. I get it. There are barriers that are real. But seriously, if you can brew beer, you can grow mushrooms. And guess what? Even if you can't brew beer, if you got somebody in your neighborhood who can, a single mono tub, 6 flushes or so of mushrooms, about a pound of dried mushrooms per tub for the cost of some grain, right? And some plastic, some equipment, very, very low investment, produces really exponential growth in fungal mass that produces what we're talking about, access to psilocybin, right?
We're talking about access to psychedelics, but
psilocybin is an
example.
The democratic one. It's a very democratic one. We could game this out with DMT too. Anybody selling DMT, whoa, they're taking you for a ride. Alexander Shulgin in his book Tikal said DMT is everywhere. Nature is drenched in DMT. If you just Google the number of plant families that contain extractable quantities of DMT, it's a laundry list of plant families. Now, this is literally extractivist kind of approaches, but hey, we can grow these things. Okay, if we decriminalize the not just the use, the holding, but the growth. For personal use, grow, gather, give is a strategy that has been put forth by the decriminalize.
Absolutely heard that recently, and definitely been having that conversation as well about decriminalization.
So why do we need a middleman? Why do we need some capitalist who's profiting off of these things when what we really need is to remove the fear and the stigma and allow communities who are interested in these experiences, facilitate them. They're certainly more accountable. I mean, okay, how accountable are you to your neighborhood association compared to 7-Eleven or Walgreens or Amazon.com?
Well, you can't even change it. You can't change your yard or paint your house a different color without talking to your neighborhood association.
You could actually run and take it over, right? Which people have done.
You could do that. Yeah, you could do that as well.
And forget about the edifice of a neighborhood association, which I'm not really into. I don't have one. Your next door neighbor, if you are mean to them, is your life going to not be good?
It's gonna get a little rough.
Right. Yeah. But if you get poor service at Kroger, good luck.
Yeah. Well, you could have a strongly worded conversation with the manager, Brian. But I get your point.
Good luck.
I get your point. Yeah, I get your point. All right. So, if I were to sum up this aspect of our conversation, what I hear you saying, I believe, is there is exponential power and influence at the individual level when individuals are free to, without penalty or stigma, grow and use these substances. And that is actually how we have perhaps a better shot of breaking the monopoly of corporations. We do that by actually putting the power of growth and use. Would you say grow, give, Grow,
Grow,
gather,
gather,
give.
give. So
Grow, gather,
we
give. Put that in the
as,
put that in the hands of individuals.
yeah, as if you go to Symposia and check out the +3 podcast, we did a panel discussion at the Capitol Psychedelic Summit, which is DC, called Grow, Gather, Give is an inherently anti-capitalist strategy, and that is a good thing.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
So I would encourage people to pay attention to what's happened in Oregon. So in Oregon, you have Measure 110 and Measure 109 that passed simultaneously. This is what we would call a great natural experiment in the policy world. So Measure 110 decriminalized all drugs, provided a lot of support for public health and the approach to drug addiction and drug use as a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue. All drugs, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and I would like to be very, very clear that Symposia as a nonprofit, as an advocacy and watchdog organization, absolutely unequivocally supports the full decriminalization of all drugs. So kudos, Oregon, the state that I grew up in. Measure 109 legalized psilocybin therapy. So psilocybin service centers were legalized. And there's a 2-year period where they're going to work with the Oregon Health Administration and a psilocybin advisory board, and they're going to figure out what the parameters are. Like what do these facilities look like? Who's qualified to be a facilitator? What is the fee structure? What does the HVAC system have to look like in these centers? All the legalistic stuff. Okay, so we have 2 systems. One is that if you get caught with drugs, they are decriminalized, which means that it is an administrative infraction if you get caught with a personal amount of anything, heroin, LSD, whatever. And the fee is $100. So it's like a parking ticket. So it's still technically illegal. There's reasons for why that's a smart strategy. And that the price for that, I think I just said that. I don't know. It's administrative fee, $100.
Well, and actually, what I'm curious about is, from your perspective, what are the benefits of still having it be, to some degree, illegal, though not so egregious in terms of
We'll get to that in one moment, but I wanted to say that $100 fee is actually waivable if you submit to a health screening. So you get caught with methamphetamine, and maybe you don't have $100. Okay, crap. What do I do now? Do I go to jail? No, you don't go to jail. You talk to a social worker or a nurse, maybe both, and they say, "Hey, how you doing? Are you okay? Are you having problematic substance use? Are you housing secure? Do you have a job? What's going on with you?"
You're like, "Yeah, I have a job. I have a family. I have housing. I have a functional life."
And if that's you, they say, "Have a nice day."
Yeah.
And you don't pay $100. So, and I will get to your question, but I want to say this: basic market failure is non-excludability. Napster had to be crushed because the price of a product that can be copy and pasted is 0. So we've already covered the exponential growth that is possible with fungi. So I think it's fascinating what's happening in Oregon, because you have $100 maybe if you get caught by a
very low. That's a very low barrier to market entry. It's going to cost me $100.
Or a psilocybin therapeutic service where you go into a room. Maybe it's a real nice room. Maybe it's a real nice person, but you didn't know that person when you walked in there. And for some people, that's going to be good. They want to know somebody is there. But other people are going to want to go and hike in the woods or go to a hot tub and do however they'd like to do. So is there a business model there?
Yeah.
Is my question.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the benefits of like, a decriminalization situation, Portugal decriminalized in like 2001.
Mhm.
It didn't fall off into the sea. They're still there. But it is illegal to, to manufacture and distribute. So dealers are, still criminals, right?
Actually, my question is not so much that. My question is more, what is the benefit of still allowing some degree, even if it's small, some degree of illegality with these substances? So decrim doesn't make them legal.
Yeah,
It just makes them not so egregiously illegal. What is the
right.
benefit of that?
The benefit of that is that you're not going to have a Walmart of psychedelics. Okay. So the reality is that we've had, let's see, Controlled Substances Act was like 1971. Okay. So psychedelics before that point were effectively legal in the United States. So Owsley was the first underground LSD chemist. They busted him. They had to give his lab equipment back because he was manufacturing LSD and that wasn't illegal. Okay. So, so that was then, but decriminalization will turn things into an administrative infraction. So that we're not talking about a legal state where Owsley was functioning. We're talking about a post-prohibition scenario where you're not going to see a giant compass pathways show up in Oregon tomorrow. Okay, the only people, only because of 109 is there going to be a thing called the Psilocybin Service Center because it's legal. Okay.
Yeah.
And that creates sort of a market. And I would say that, Portugal has functioned just fine for 2 decades under decriminalization. I don't think anybody in Portugal is complaining for lack of access to whatever their preferred drug is.
Gotcha. Okay.
I don't think so.
It's interesting because I think this does change the nature and structure of what could be thought about as the kingdom, right? Where now you have individuals who can essentially drive their own destiny in terms of how they engage with psychedelics.
Tammy, let me ask you a question. Would you rather live in the United States or Saudi Arabia?
Well, I'm the roughest person to ask that question of because I actually did consider living in Saudi Arabia. I think that there are pros and cons on both sides, interestingly. But what's the question behind the question? What's the point behind the question?
Saudi Arabia is a kingdom.
It is. Yeah, it is. It is. And
So
there are pros and cons on.
What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world that is where we are, free or subjects?
Yeah. It is interesting though, because if we are sort of mired in the toxicity of capitalism, how free are we?
I mean, here's the thing. I get you. And it is a problem. And those who are anti-capitalists, the solution is not to stay here. I think Winston Churchill said, when walking through hell, keep walking. The idea is to build on top. The only way socialism or anarchism or communism will ever emerge is literally on top of capitalism. There's no other way to do it. Okay. Yeah. The solution is not to go back to feudalism though. Yeah. And a lot of the corporate actors, take a look at there's a guy named Richard Wolff, Harvard, Stanford, Yale trained economist, Marxist. He's got a great podcast website called Democracy at Work. If you go to work, just go ahead and look at your corporate organizational structure. It is a dictatorship. Okay. It is, we work 55 hours a week on average in a completely undemocratic institution. And the only workplace institutions that are democratic are unions, and they are vigorously resisted
And opposed.
by
yes.
every, business that is faced with them.
Yep.
They're existential threats.
Yeah. So it is an interesting point to ponder, Brian, and I definitely appreciate you bringing it up. All right, I want to ask you something else. I'm going to shift topics just a little bit. I want to talk about MAPS, pragmatism, and access. MAPS as a public benefit corporation says that it prioritizes public benefit over profit. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how credible is this priority given MAPS? Some of the things that you've critiqued about MAPS. What? Yeah, I want to stop there because I have a bunch of follow-on questions, but I want to stop there. This sort of, how credible is this declaration from MAPS?
I mean, so B corporations are what we're talking about, public benefit corporations. These are entities that, unlike a typical corporation, are able to dispense with the general fiduciary responsibility of generating shareholder profit every quarter without removing and replacing the CEO, right? So they are profit-making entities that can occasionally make decisions that are more mission-oriented rather than profit-oriented. So interesting, somewhat novel model. And this is the structure that MAPS has taken so MAPS, as I understand it, so they're a nonprofit, and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is owned by the nonprofit. So that nonprofit controls this B corporation that will be able to administer MDMA and MDMA therapy in their in the period in which they have a patent on their drug therapy combo, which I believe lasts for about 5 years. Okay, so that's the scenario, and in that scenario, initially, people who would like to access this therapy will not have the benefit of they're not likely to have the benefit of insurance coverage for it. So it will likely be out of pocket for those first early adopters. 5 years isn't that long. So insurance
tell you
companies,
what it is if you just got a compound complex PTSD diagnosis and you're trying to heal, it's a long time. I couldn't wait.
I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I couldn't
that's
wait.
a long time.
Yeah.
And so again, I will just say decriminalizing MDMA is going to be a lot quicker and more accessible than it is to build up this ginormous thing that is designed to interface with the insurance and medical institutions that are pre-existing, that are already failing people. So actually, I want to point this out to your viewers. I had a tumor removed from my arm recently. I do not have medical insurance. I don't have medical insurance.
Wait, you're a university professor. You don't have medical insurance?
I am a lecturer. Okay.
Oh, you can't get me started.
Can we talk about academia for a minute?
No, you can't. You can't. I have a PhD, and there's a reason why I don't work in academia. I got my PhD and promptly got out of academia. There's a reason for that.
Psychedelic studies is the only way they drug me back into it. Okay.
Yeah.
So my wife and son have medical insurance, but I do not. So when I talk about access to healthcare and psychedelic mental health care, I'm not speaking from a position of an armchair philosopher here.
Yeah.
Millions of Americans do not have insurance, and the current power structure seems not very concerned about making sure that they do. So this is the situation that MAPS is entering into, mind you, through no fault of their own. But what was the question again?
The question was, and you are speaking to the question. The question is, if MAPS as a public benefit corporation says that it prioritizes public benefit above profit, what is your perspective about how credible this priority is given MAPS's actions?
I would say if we're trying to maximize public benefit, then the strategy of medicalization has already proven itself to be not as effective as decriminalization. So look, like I've spoken to many of the strategists that have worked diligently and earnestly, and I don't want to take away from their efforts. I think that they really did think long and hard about the situation that they were in. Many of them were thinking about this in the 80s. Okay. Rick Doblin started MAPS the second that MDMA was outlawed. So, so I don't want to fault people for doing the best that they could with what they had. But look, the debate has already been settled, at least in terms of the first mover, which I think is an investment term we discuss sometimes. The person who crossed the policy that crossed the finish line in terms of providing access to psychedelics to Americans is decriminalization. The entire state of Oregon, if one would like to have access to mushrooms, I've lived in Oregon. There are plenty of people who will figure that out for you. Or you could just join your local mycological society and go take a hike and go find those mushrooms that grow either in wood chips or dung, have a removable gelatinous pellicule, a purple brown spore print, and bruise blue. And that is a 99.9% identifier for psilocybe mushrooms that contain psilocybin. So the barriers, to access to psychedelics, to me, are fear, stigma, and education. Okay, the solutions are community and discussion,
and decriminalization.
Because, look, at Symposia and personally, I'm a yes and kind of guy. Like if you want to take MDMA, you want to take psilocybin with a clinician to address your, major depressive disorder, your complex PTSD, like more power to you. Go for it. Like especially if you have the coverage that can pay for it, go for it. For those of us who would rather or don't have any other option other than to, work with trusted community members, friends, I don't see why those people should be prevented. And I would say that abuses in all of these scenarios are going to be much better addressed when these experiences are not criminalized.
Gotcha. One kind of follow-on thought I want to explore about MAPS. I read a piece from you that made this kind of cogent and powerful case that MAPS is dancing with the devils of corrupt and systemic structural ills as it pursues mainstreaming psychedelics. Now, as it stands, if and when psychedelics are truly mainstream, Doblin's going to be hailed by many as a hero. I know for me personally, if it hadn't been for MAPS, I don't know how much longer it would have taken me to find psychedelics because they were the most visible entity. And so when I went to search for what could possibly be done for my PTSD, it was the work of MAPS that first showed me what was possible. Now, I couldn't get into a MAPS trial. There's no way it was accessible to me, but I, at least because of what MAPS showed me, I knew what was possible. And then I just had to figure out, how do I go find that thing? What I'm struck by is my perspective that Doblin is a sort of work within the systems kind of guy who can afford to work within the system because it's not actively oppressing him with the same fervor as it does the historically disempowered. I think he's also been seen as kind of a, David taking on Goliath of the federal government, sort of taking on the man. the question I have for you is, when you're advocating, for any one of us who's advocating for access, what utility, if any, is there to a Doblin-like by any means or money necessary approach?
Well, okay, so there's some things to unpack here. So, by any means necessary, I'm sure that there are other associations, but I associate that slogan with Malcolm X, community defense, and just an uncompromising stance for the advancement of people who, have been absolutely downtrodden and enslaved and oppressed. And yes, we so by any means necessary is there. Dancing with the devil, this is a realpolitik approach. Realpolitik is is similar in many ways to by any means necessary. But what's not being said is another common slogan of the era, which is the medium is the message and the personal is political. And so, the institutionalization, the bureaucratization of psychedelics becomes the experience of those psychedelics.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
If your psychological priming for your trip is filling out forms for an hour, that is going to have an effect. If your experience of seeking psychedelics, which I would imagine might map to your own experience, was discovering that this is inaccessible, but you're not going to take no for an answer. And so by any means necessary, you will free your mind from pain, from suffering, from negative thought loops, self-destructive and awful patterns that don't serve you, and they don't serve your community, and they don't serve your family, and they don't serve your children and your children's children. You don't take no for an answer when those are the stakes. You don't stand in line obediently when those are the stakes. At least I don't. And that's something that I think we lose when we wrap it all in plastic, when we systematize it. Now, harm reduction is a great strategy for making sure that those adventurers of the mind, those people who are attempting to liberate themselves from whatever, don't injure themselves in their questing and play.
Yeah.
This is where wisdom is useful, but it's not the same as the trappings of control and bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's interesting. For those of us who find ourselves and have always found ourselves sort of underserved or altogether disserviced by unhealthy systems, I have to wonder if we do right by ourselves to put the job of challenging and dismantling systems in the hands of institutions. For example, my instinct told me that if I left my fate up to an institution like MAPS, as well-meaning as it is, I could potentially die waiting for a solution, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it was, but I am doggedly pragmatic, right? So, I have to wonder, how pragmatism services access advocacy, and then also how pragmatism undermines access advocacy.
Well, look, so you mentioned that, you are a queer woman, right? So my understanding of, like the queer story is that in some ways, there was some compromise surrounding like gay marriage.
Yep.
Like that there was that to get certain legal protections, there was a little bit of buttoning up of what the queer experience actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. This takes us right back to where we started with the compass pathways conversation, right? That there's a degree of, if I want to sort of live if I want to live, I can't say free, but if I want to live, at least like minimize the amount of oppression that I have to cope with, there is this system that I have to figure out how to pull that system open so it makes room for me. Right. And I
I
like
hear what you're saying.
gay marriage is a really good example of that, for sure. And you know, as you can see, I'm bought in. And it was interesting because I used to get a lot of grief for supporting gay marriage. I had gay friends who were like, how can you possibly support this oppressive, patriarchal, gender conforming system? I went to a women's college. I would get a lot of grief for supporting gay marriage. And what I would say is, why do straight people get to own marriage? And I rarely ever swear on this podcast, but fuck straight people. They don't get to own gay marriage, right?
Sure.
So, that was really my thinking about that. And I kind of have the same thought process around psychedelics. Like, fuck rich white authoritarian people. They don't get to own psychedelics, right? And so this is why I am interested in kind of the both and. Like, that's my pragmatism is the both and approach as well. Like, I want access to the institutions and I want the freedom from the institutions. But so that's why I'm curious about, like, is that actually more harmful than productive from your perspective? And I'm just, you're not the authority on this, but you have really good perspective on it. So I just want to hear what you have to say about it.
So what is traded? What is traded when we make these decisions, when we go for these movements, when we cater to the mainstream, when we play the politics of the possible versus going for the gold?
Gotcha. Yeah, you're calling out, be mindful of the trade-offs. Is it really worth it?
Yeah. Are we building a world we actually want to live in?
Yeah.
I think that's a question we absolutely must ask ourselves when we're talking about the temple of the mind. So the reality is, I think a lot about how particularly bringing it back to climate change, okay? The dominant religions on this planet are linear and they end in apocalypse, okay? And there's a thing called
do they all really? I mean, I know
the dominant religions.
I know Christianity is about the apocalypse, but I don't know much about Judaism or Islam. I mean, are they?
Judaism is all the Abrahamic religions do have an end time.
Interesting.
They're linear in their conception.
Great, Brian.
Of
now
time.
I got some other thing I got to go look up. Thanks a lot, man. Just you're making my head explode.
One way or another, right? So I mean, and obviously there are other religions out there that don't follow this. But if we're talking sheer numbers, and who has been technologically and politically dominant for the last couple hundred years, we need to pay attention to the mindscape of those people who believe, and some of whom are actually fervently trying to bring about the end of the world, because the end of the world brings the kingdom of heaven. And if we were to have dominion over the land and the plants and the animals, to do whatever we like with it, that places us at the top of the hierarchy. I mentioned I'm an ecologist, and the way life actually works is in cycles and in interdependence, and competition floats upon a sea of cooperation, in my view. Now,
competition floats on a sea of cooperation.
Yeah. So the way we think about the world that we live in helps create that world. I believe this is called the intersubjective space. It's the difference. It's the nexus between the objective world that we imagine the laws of physics or something obeys, mathematics, and the subjective, our daydreams, our opinions, our positionality and perspective. Those perspective, where the rubber hits the road in between those, is where our ideas influence reality.
Mm.
And this is where, if we dare to dream, we might get a better reality.
Mm. Okay.
And so we must dream, I wouldn't say carefully, but wildly.
Mm. Very interesting. Brian, your thoughts and views have definitely seeped into my mindscape. I really, really appreciate you taking time to just taking time to talk with me and talk these ideas over with me and give me even more to think about. Hopefully, this
Yeah,
has been a useful conversation for you as well, and hopefully, we get to do it again. I would love to catch up with you, a couple years on from now.
sure. No, it was enjoyable, and I, just be wary of salesmen, people.
In all things, anyone trying to sell you something is also trying to separate you from some part of yourself.
Mhm.
So, in all things, Brian, until we meet again.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.